Well, thank you very much. Apart from 16 years as a government minister, I've spent my life as a businessman. And I therefore recognise that the most important thing in business is to discover those few things that are certain, because most things are uncertain, and we spend our lives dealing with the uncertainties, the things that come in that you never actually thought were going to come in, and they're the ones that can so easily turn the business upside down. But it is quite a good idea, at least to start off, by deciding what is actually certain. And climate change is certain. There is no question that every year, whatever we do, it'll get worse in our lifetime. Now, the crucially important bit about that is that businesses really cannot operate unless they accept the certainties, because the uncertainties are the ones that you've got to concentrate on. And when I started Sancroft, which is the company I chair, 26 years ago, the thing I was trying to get people to understand was that the issues of sustainability more generally, and increasingly climate change more centrally, are advantages if you take them right. And they only become disadvantages if you start from the assumption, oh my goodness me, we've got another incubus, there's something more I've got to pay for. And in those days it was perfectly true. Everybody thought sustainability was a cost. And then I met the chairman of Coca-Cola one day. We worked for Coca-Cola over many, many years. And he said to me, John, what I mean about sustainability is that I want to be here in 125 years like I've been here for 125 years. The fundamental issue of sustainability is actually to make the business continue. And the things which will enable that to happen, the recognition of the world that we now live in. And at the heart of that is a world which every year will be affected by climate change. And I think what Cathy said in her introduction was a wonderful setting for it, because that is exactly what's happened. And if you look at what's happened in Scotland, where a month's rain falls in 24 hours, you realise that the infrastructure which we have created is incapable of handling the new kind of weather. I had a piece of real luck last year. I was rifling through the books which were on sale in our parish church's sale. You know, we all go to the fete, and I looked through these books, and there was a book written by an American serviceman in 1945. He'd come right at the end of the war, for the first time he'd ever been abroad. He'd come from the back of beyond, somewhere in Alabama, and he'd come to Britain. And he wrote this fascinating little book about what it was like to come to Britain for the first time. And in it, he talks about the weather. This is in East Anglia. He came to Suffolk. He talks about the weather. He said it's wonderful in Britain because you don't have the rain coming down in great downpours. You have soft, refreshing rain through the year. And then he said, and you know, we don't have those witheringly hot summers that we have in America. You have just gentle warmth for much of July and August. That was in 1945. It could not be further from the truth in 2023. And that's the thing we have to remember, how rapidly all this has changed. When I started gardening, because I'm so old, when I started gardening, spring came 17 days later than it does now. And any gardener, if you've got some right-wing individual you've got to have a go at, start with gardening, because they know, the one thing they know is that the garden is different. And the blooming flowers come out before the pollinators. So we've actually interrupted that system which gives us life. It's absolutely fundamental. And the problem we have is that we fail to recognize the inherent connection between creating resilience now and mitigating for the future. Those two things need to come together. And the resilience bit is pathetic in this country because governments will not face up to the realities. I'm not excusing any government, and I don't think it's necessarily true that if you change the government you get anything much better, because people are always under these pressures. If you noticed, when the Labour Party absolutely rightly said we're not going to have new oil fields and coal mines in the 2030s, we're not going to do that. The first two sets of people who attacked them were their two biggest donors, the two biggest unions who give them money. So they are in the same position of any government. The pressures that come not to do things you ought to do for the future, but to do things which are convenient at the moment. And when you think of Rishi Sunak's ridiculous statement that he wasn't going to have 7 bins, no one ever suggested we'd have 7 bins. When he said we're not going to force people to carry more people in their cars. No one's ever suggested that. But it's all part of the inability of politicians, of all political parties, to recognise that we have actually got to face the public with the realities. Because if we don't, they will face us with them. When those terrible floods took place a few years ago in Germany, for the very first time, you heard the local people saying, why has the government not done enough about climate change? People aren't foolish. They can put things off like all the rest of us. But when it comes to it, they know that those changes are taking place. And of course, we've got to do it in a just way. Of course, we've got to do it in a sensible way. Of course, we've got to make sure that we take as many people with us as we can. But what we must not do is to refuse to accept the realities. And it's that business surely ought to accept first, because business needs to face those facts, otherwise it won't be in business. And interestingly, in what Kathy said at the beginning, she talked about supply chain. Because what we have to remember is that the supply chain is impacted by climate change in an enormous way. COVID brought the problems of the supply chain very sharply to view. We found in Sancroft a whole lot of people who were our clients who really didn't know about their supply chain properly at all. And now that one has got to deal with the category 3 emissions, they're beginning to discover there are people in the supply chain who are crucial to them, but they haven't really thought about it. So that is a business imperative which you here have got to play a big part in it, because your supply chains are particularly difficult and complicated. Coca-Cola, I remember, allows me to say this, but they couldn't send out their 6-packs in Japan during COVID because they got everything right. They've got other sources for everything except the glue. And the glue came from somewhere near Wuhan. So one just has to see that even the best find this very difficult. And the supply chain is going to be a crucial part of what we do in order to make sure about resilience. And the problem with climate change, it's not just direct. It's not just about flooding factories or making it impossible for people to produce directly. It's the indirect effects too, because more and more of the world will be disrupted by climate change. I remember the moment when that really came home to me in the House of Lords, when a very sensible question from that remarkable man, Lord Alton, about the invasion of Christian villages by Muslims, other villages, when the minister, of course, said how appalling this was and how dreadful it was, but she then finished by saying, but we have to remember that because of climate change, those Muslim villages had no water and the Christian villages had water. And the excuse of religion enabled them to provide water for their children. That is what climate change will do. It will be constantly disruptive. and it will be disruptive indirectly as well as directly, and we have to recognise that. And that's why I do think all these things about migrants are so distressing, because this government has got to learn that the problems we've got about migration today are nothing like the problems we are going to have, because temperatures rising as they do, it's not a question of people moving for a better life. It will be people moving for a life, because you can't live if the temperatures are 50 degrees centigrade. And that's what's happening in places like Niamey in Niger. And they're moving into Morocco. And Morocco is pushing the Moroccans into Spain. And if you look at the situation, we talk about our immigration, my goodness, the Italians can talk about it. And the Greeks have islands filled with people because of the pressures which are enhanced and extended by climate change. So we are in a situation in which we have to recognise the resilience we talk about is a very large question about railway lines which have got to be able to withstand temperatures which they were never built for. Road surfaces which become impossible because of the heat. All sorts of things we haven't thought about in Britain have got to be thought about, which is why the Climate Change Committee was so absolutely appalled by the government's 5-year plan, which took none of this into account. It was just a bit of fiddling at the edges. And yet, month by month, we see this, all of us, and we know we have to make those pressures and we have to meet it ourselves, because in the end the government will have to do it. The thing that is at least certain is that they may be pathetic in doing it and slow in doing it, and the opposition may not be brave enough, but the fact of the matter is, in the end, the realities of life will force it. And it'll be more expensive, more difficult, and you're going to have to deliver it. I'm afraid that is the fact of life. So net zero is what we are aiming at. And there was just one thing, Cathy, that I do think one has to say about net zero, as well as the very sensible things you said, which is that both words matter, net and zero. That the zero is about bringing down the emissions to the very lowest we can. The net is recognising that one of the things that we've done is to make it less possible for the earth and the sea to take in the carbon. And we therefore have got to make the world more resilient. And in the work that your industry does, of course, enabling the earth to do its job properly and the seas to do their job properly is a hugely important part of your planning and the way that you deal with the environment. And so there are, I think, 3 things I want to leave you with. First of all, you need to use your professionalism. You've come here because you know that your professionalism demands an understanding of climate change, of what that means for your businesses, what it means for your clients, what it means right the way down the supply chain. But the fascinating thing for me, because I've been around so long, is the huge change among engineers in particular. I remember when engineers were conquerors. They went out there and drove things through and built things over and found an answer to impose things. And what's happened in 50 years is the move to an understanding that we actually have to work with the earth, with the planet. Now, most of you will be surprised at what I'm just about to say, but the best piece of reading you could do today is just to look up on the internet and see the latest letter of Pope Francis. It's called Laudatum Deum. It's the follow-up to his Laudato Si, the great encyclical 8 years ago. And you don't need to be religious. You just need to, it's the most wonderful summing up of the stupid position we've got ourselves into and what we have to do. It's short, sharp, and frighteningly true, and well worth looking up and just reading, because it just puts the whole thing into a proper context of saying this is the world we live in, and if we want our children to live in a world anything like this, we actually have to make some fundamental changes in the way in which that first bit of your rather nice noise and music as we started says. And it's your professionalism which we will rely on to deliver that. And then there's the question of how you influence politics. I know it's a kind of improper conversation in a meeting like this, but I'm going to shock you even more than that. I want to ask a simple question. Will everybody who has been in touch with their local member of parliament on climate change during the last 6 months put their hands up? Well, you've beaten every audience I've spoken to in the last 3 weeks. Yay. Brilliant. But it's only 9 out of this. Now, the point is, members of parliament only listen to their constituents. And in this year of an election, when more people don't know how they're going to vote than any period that I've ever thought of, heard of before, this is the moment to get this in. So I beg of you to get on and go to see your member of parliament and talk about it from your professional understanding. This is what I have to do. These are the things that are happening. This is how my business has to change. This is what my customers think. And you do that. You ring up and get an appointment, and they'll always ask you what it's for, and the answer is don't tell them. Tell them that it's a personal matter between you and the member of parliament, because then they won't find an excuse that he hasn't got time or she hasn't got time. But I want everybody around the country to do that, because if you do that, we will get a change. There are many good members of parliament in all parties that really care about this. But there are bad ones in all parties too. There's one member of parliament, the Labour Party, who's actually a member of the Climate Change the anti-climate change organisation. And yet he's standing there, and I want every Labour voter to give him what for on it, because this is what has to happen. And there are lots of Tories and Liberal Democrats in the same position. So it's really important for that to happen, because you professionally need that. Because the government, the quicker the government moves, the cheaper and the better it is for you. And we've got to reclaim democracy, because otherwise Just Stop Oil will be right. Because what they're saying is the democratic system doesn't work fast enough to do what we have to do. So we all have a duty, and it's part of our professionalism. And because we're professional, we can say things which no one else can say, and we can convince in a way which no one else can convince. So please, everybody, and thank you for the 9, that is remarkable, and I shall put that down because it is too good. And I want to end just on one other thing. When I meet when I meet leaders of business, as I do, as in Sancroft, we're working with people right across the board. There comes a moment when we've talked about the business, we've talked about how we deal with sustainability, we've talked about climate change, we've talked about the supply chain, we've done all that. And then I want to talk about him or her. Because in the end, we have to be the leaders as individuals in what we do, how we act. I did a platform with down in Surrey for the Surrey Commission on Climate Change. And one of the other speakers was Natalie Bennett, the ex-leader of the Green Party, with whom I don't agree very often. Anyway, she said something which appalled me. She said, I don't care what people do individually, it's all systemic change we need. That is absolute nonsense, because nobody listens to a business unless it does it itself. And nobody in a business listens to any one of us unless we do it ourselves. And what climate change is challenging us is to think ourselves of how we as individuals are going to act because our grandchildren are going to ask us, and what did you do in the war, Daddy, Mummy? That's what they're going to ask. And it's a pretty tough question for any of us here. So I finish by saying it starts with us as individuals. It moves on to us in the democratic structure in which we live, making sure that politicians of all kinds and the organisations we belong to, whether it's Rotary or the church or whatever it is, are doing these things as well. And then it is fundamentally and crucially about our businesses and the way in which we use our expertise in order to make this country more resilient, because it has to be, and then mitigate climate change so that we can control the amount of heat that arises. Just think how awful has been the effect of 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial heat, and think that we are at the moment on course for 3.5. That is not a world in which any of us can live, and that's why all this matters and why we've come to the carbon crunch. See, I've even done what she told me to do before and moved over.
Everybody does what I tell them to do. Thank you ever so much. I don't really know where to start, and we've only got 4 minutes for questions, which have been canvassed both from the room and online as well, because we have an online audience of a couple of hundred people who I should have probably welcomed earlier to the session. Businesses, infrastructure, we're often seen at odds with climate action and biodiversity. You talked about gardening, and clearly, you know, you're sat in front of a very nice green display in the room here to remind us about the importance of biodiversity. What's your perception of the key successes delivered by infrastructure in reducing carbon, and what would you like to see more of in terms of restoring the balance of nature?
Well, I think it's just making decisions through that lens all the time, thinking about it and thinking about new ways of doing it and being conscious all the time and recognising, you know, we've been so foolish about nature. Victorians were actually curious enough, better about it. All those Victorian parks, they knew people needed. They needed the air and needed those places. And London is amazing because of that very thing. And we know also that you plant enough trees and you're actually not just taking in carbon, but you're actually lowering the heat. Crucially important to plant urban trees. But also when roads are built or resurfaced, it's not just the surfacing which has got to face the new heat, no, but it's also the use of the sides. I mean, some roads you see, and people have really gone into sensible treatment of it so that you've actually increased the biodiversity, and you don't have a lot of straggling trees which have been planted and going to die. I don't ever talk about planting more trees. I talk about looking after more trees, because the planting doesn't help if you don't look after them.
No, I completely agree. I think one of the other benefits, as you're sort of alluding to there, is the resilience, the increased resilience you can get from the shading effect of trees over railway lines, roads and so on. And you talked about resilience sort of throughout your opening remarks. We can't afford to have everything working all the time, can we? You know, the scale of the challenge we're faced with, as you so clearly articulated, is quite staggering. How do we go about having a conversation about what an acceptable level of failure is in our services?
Well, I don't think you can start from that end. I think you have to say, look, this is a battle which human ingenuity can overcome. Now we know, because that's what makes us responsible, we know what's happening, and we can find a way of dealing with it. And we want to deal with it in a way which does, in fact, ensure that the lights don't go off, to take it at its extreme. And therefore, we have to argue what we're doing on that basis. We have to say we're doing this in order that the lights won't go off. And you can get people on side if you say that. If you say, well, we're going to sort of half do it and therefore your lights might go off. I'm sorry, people are not going to, that's not a battle we're going to win. But we do have to say to people some things. I mean, it's ludicrous. You won't like this. It's ludicrous that we've still got a road building program of the kind. The idea that we're really going to spend money putting a tunnel underneath the Stonehenge. I mean, I know you'd love to do it and all that, but the fact of the matter is, it's a really bad use of money. And we've really got to better, I mean, I happen not to agree with the government on HS2, but that's a different issue. All I'm saying is we've got to look at these things. And one of the things is, if you build more roads, you have more traffic. And there is no question about that. And you really have to behave in a different way. And that's the sort of thing, but you've got to do it in the way in which you say we're going to make things better, not make things worse. And therefore you do these things, and the Treasury hates this. Above all, you use hypothecation. You say, if you pay for that, that's what comes. At the moment, you say, if you pay that, it goes into the Treasury and you never see it again. What you need to have, that's why the landfill tax was such a success, because half the money was used for improving the environment locally. And that's what people cared about. And therefore, they didn't mind the tax. Then in came the new government, happened to be a Labour government. Labour government came in and they took the money away. So it's not just Tories.
Gosh, on that note, thank you very much for joining us today.